It's an absolute joy and a pleasure to have Bill with us tonight, giving the annual Lisa Jardine Memorial Lecture. As I'm sure you all know, Lisa was a towering figure, a public intellectual, an incredible force in early modern scholarship, literary, cultural, historical, someone also with an absolute passion for science and the history of science. Her work ranged so widely, and she inspired so many. She was also the first female fellow of Jesus College, and a tremendous supporter of younger women academics, to whom she liberally gave out these behave badly badges, which we all wear with pride to this day. Bill is a fantastically appropriate person to be giving this Lisa Jardine lecture. Bill studied with Lisa and was a great friend of hers. Bill is now the director of the Warburg Institute in London. He's had a very glittering career from his first degree at Columbia, his MPhil and PhD here in Cambridge. And some of us remember Bill back in the day wearing a rather distinctive green t-shirt and black jeans, both a little tighter than native English people were accustomed to wear at that time. Since then, he's taught at the University of Maryland. He's held visiting fellowships all over the world, and he was the founding director of CREMS, the Centre for Renaissance and Early Modern Studies at York. At York University, there's a very well-established Centre for Medieval Studies and a very well-established Centre for 18th Century Studies. And Bill arrived and he barged through the middle and said, henceforth, there will be a very important Centre for Renaissance and Early Modern Studies. Then he moved south to become Director of Research at the V&A. And then finally, to what I like to think is his natural habitat, the Warburg Institute in London, an institute dedicated to the study of the classical tradition, but much more than that, a hub of interdisciplinary activity with an amazing library. And those of us who know Bill Sherman know that Bill likes a library. He's published in many areas. He's edited plays by Shakespeare and Marlowe and Johnson. He's written extensively about travel and encounter, about spies and spying, and perhaps what we know him best for, about reading and marginalia. Among his many books and publications, perhaps I don't know what's most important, but there's a very important book about John Dee, with an amazing central chapter called The Living Library, and a fantastic book about marginalia called Used Books. When a prominent academic dies, it's often said that they live on through their published work and their books. And that's obviously true of Lisa Jardine, but I think it's also immensely true of Lisa Jardine that she lives on through her kind of networks of people. So many people who were touched by her scholarship and her friendship. And I know that here today we have people from Jesus College, of course. We have people from the wider University of Cambridge, especially from the English faculty, where she herself taught, but also from the history faculty. I believe that online there are people from Queen Mary, where she spent much of her career and where her career really flourished. And I know that there are people from both the York and the Princeton diasporas here in the Frankopan Hall today. So many people all connected to Lisa Jardine and her scholarship. So without further ado, let me hand over to Bill Sherman, who is going to talk about Erasmus, somebody that Lisa Jardine herself published on very importantly and extensively, and the reader's eye. Over to you, Bill.
Oh, thank you so much, Mary. It's a real pleasure to be back among friends in Cambridge, and a true honor to speak in memory of Lisa Jardine in the place where I first met her. I'm just sorry that John, Lisa's husband, wasn't able to join us today, and I very much hope he's behind one of those cameras, lying comfortably after a medical procedure, which I think was fine. So, John, hi and welcome, and anyone else from Lisa's extended family, very, very happy to have had this invitation. Now, when I was invited to deliver this year's lecture, it took me some time to settle on a subject. After all, there is almost nothing that Lisa herself wasn't interested in or willing to say something about. And there's certainly no stage in my own scholarly career, no subject that I myself worked on that she didn't have a hand in shaping. But it quickly struck me that a chapter in progress on Erasmus and marginalia would take me right to the heart of what I learned from Lisa during my time under her tutelage. And in fact, it touches on two seminal publications that form the bookends, as it were, of my formative years here in Cambridge. My arrival as a graduate student in 1988 coincided with Lisa's return from Princeton, where she had been a fellow at the Shelby Cullom Davis Center for Historical Studies. And that was, of course, the year that she and Tony Grafton discovered Gabriel Harvey's heavily annotated copy of Livy and wrote the Past and Present article that almost single-handedly reinvented the history of reading, at least that part of it that focused on marginalia. The influence on my own dissertation of that work, devoted as it would be to annotated books from the library of the Elizabethan polymath John Dee, should be obvious. But the project for which Lisa was actually granted this fellowship in Princeton was a study of Erasmus of Rotterdam as Renaissance Europe's leading intellectual and textual authority. So alongside my work on the dissertation, I served as Lisa's research assistant for the book that became Erasmus Man of Letters, published to great acclaim in 1993, the year I left Cambridge to take up my first job. Now, some 30 years later, I find myself putting Erasmus at the center of a monograph on visual marginalia and reading as a visual rather than verbal mode, called The Reader's Eye, work in progress for a monograph under contract with Reaction Books. It's closely connected to a cluster of new projects that I've since been pursuing on the interface of the verbal and the visual, but it grows directly from the research on reader's marks that I've been doing since Lisa first opened my eyes to the mysteries of marginal annotations. That work, of course, culminated in Used Books, a study of the fascinating traces left behind by Renaissance readers in the volumes that passed through their hands. And as I look back over the table of contents of that book, and indeed the work on John Dee before it, and all the other work I've been involved in on the field of marginalia, there's one gap that strikes me as especially large, almost as large as the pointing hand or manicule on the cover, and that is what might be described as visual response to the text, from the use of images in the reader's imagination to the presence of pictures in the margins or other blank spaces of books. So in setting out to attend to this phenomenon, we are, I would suggest, very poorly served by both methodology and terminology. After all, I'm by no means alone in having overlooked the extent to which the visual and the verbal work and play together in the margins of post-medieval books or in the minds of Renaissance readers. Now, while the study of verbal marginalia, often described as writing in books or words next to words, while the study of verbal marginalia, growing out of English departments and textual scholarship, now occupies a well-thumbed corner of book history, which is really a proper field as a journal of that title, the study of visual marginalia has been almost entirely restricted to manuscript illumination, where it is usually a matter of production rather than reception. This blind spot further is built into our very disciplinary divisions and even the tools we use to find things in our museums or our libraries. It's also bound up with some deep narratives about periods and about media, including the transition from medieval to Renaissance, or the transition from a manuscript culture to a print culture. Now, according to the standard accounts, the Renaissance period is exactly the moment in Western history when the long-standing relationship between word and image breaks down, and the ancient link between vision and cognition is well and truly severed. Now, for Aristotle, going all the way back to the metaphysics, the eyes had been not just the chief organ of perception, but the ultimate source of clear and lasting knowledge. In the opening paragraph of the Metaphysics, Aristotle observes, "We prefer sight, generally speaking, to all other senses. The reason of this is that of all the senses, sight best helps us to know things and reveals many distinctions." And the De Anima offers what may well serve as the cognitive archetype for all ancient and medieval psychology, if we can risk some generalization. To paraphrase the lucid account of Mary Carruthers, all sensory input, including words on a page, ends up in the form of mental pictures or phantasmata, a kind of icon, Greek word for image, that can be seen by the mind's eye. It is impossible even to think, Aristotle says, without a mental picture. The same affection is involved in thinking as in drawing a diagram. But if vision was the noblest of the senses all the way from Plato to Descartes or thereabouts, as Martin Jay has suggested, the last century of its reign was troubled by a succession crisis. In the words of James Knapp, we witness an attempt to separate the reasoned, stable, and implicitly verbal world of morality from the unstable, emotional realm of visual experience in the course of the 16th century. Michael Camille, the great medieval scholar, attributes the increasing effort to bring the visual image under the control of the word to the breakdown of established truths in the Renaissance, fueled in part, and in particular, by Reformation thought. A great rift, he suggests, opens up between words and images. Language is now in a separate realm, written in discrete boxes or in fields hanging in the picture space. So in this account, the conventions of print put to an end the experiments in mixed media that are so common in medieval culture, separating word and image, as Camille says, into proper places, and banishing from the book altogether much of the visual play or textual experimentation that Camille captured in his brilliant study of grotesque illumination, image on the edge. But two very influential subsequent books treating later periods, Joseph Leo Kerner's The Reformation of the Image and Stuart Clark's recent Vanities of the Eye, have added nuance and force to this historical account, encouraging us to see how quickly and how thoroughly the Renaissance relationship with vision turns sour. Protestant Reformation brings a new iconoclastic spirit that purges the idolatrous image in favor of a purified word, replacing so-called eye service with so-called ear service. And the scientific revolution offers a new model of the eye itself, which is not only passive rather than active, but far less reliable as an instrument of perception than the telescope or the microscope or the camera obscura. So all in all, to borrow Stuart Clark's felicitous phrase, this is the moment when European culture can be said to have lost its optical nerve. So what then are we to make of an example like this, which shows no such disenchantment with the pleasures or powers of the eye, certainly no neat compartmentalization of textual or pictorial space? Now, several recent scholars have analyzed the annotations in surviving copies of what may be the most beautiful and enigmatic book ever printed, the Hypnoratomachia Polyphili, printed by Aldus Manutius in 1499, And they've discovered layers of interactive visual reading of astonishing complexity. I'm happy that one of these scholars, Chris Liu, my MA student from last year, is here with us today. He can answer all questions about what we call the HP, a very difficult text indeed. Now, as many of you will know, the printed words in this text offer a dream vision within a dream vision, and the endless ekphrastic descriptions of structures of all kinds are accompanied by all kinds of illustrations, past, present, and future, in and around the text, including buildings, ruins, gardens strewn with epigraphic fragments in multiple languages. But some readers went to great lengths to work out their own sense of these structures built up in the text, both verbal and visual, with the text guiding and licensing the reader's architectural and archaeological sensibilities. In the end, this looks increasingly like one of those books that seems not just to invite, but indeed to require the active work of the eye in order to have sense made with it. Now, between medieval illumination and modern illustration, there are many cases like this, and not like this, of marginal visualization, and countless traces of reading as a visual mode, from isolated doodles to fully fledged ornamental and pictorial schemes. Another such text that has the special power to engage the visual faculties and the active pens of its readers is Dante's Divine Comedy. Early manuscripts, such as this famous one from Holcomb, are lavishly illustrated, and most early printed editions follow suit. In fact, increasingly, like Aesop's Fables and Ovid and a few other texts, you almost never see this text without images. But readers, again, also sometimes add drawings of their own to make the text's images visible and memorable. And a particularly interesting example, which is part of this project on the reader's eye, is the great 1481 edition with commentary by Cristoforo Olandino. Now, this book, which is in Rome at the Biblioteca Valcelliana, has hundreds. First it has many printed images based on drawings by Botticelli, but this copy has hundreds of marginal sketches executed by a group of learned artists now thought to have had access to lost designs by Leonardo. And there are all kinds of things we could tease out if this were the subject of the talk today. It is one of my favorite books, and I'll just maybe dwell for a second on what's going on in two of these examples, because I think they'll set up an expectation about the way these images do rhetorical work later. In the Divine Comedy, goes without saying, you'll all know that what you generally see is Dante, sometimes Virgil, sometimes Beatrice, and you see Dante going through things, encountering things, having these hellish or paradisiacal experiences. In this book, you never see Dante. You instead see what Dante describes what he's seeing too. So in the book, because it's one of those great books that draws very heavily on the simile tradition, you get these very, very long accounts, usually triggered by the word come, which is like or as in English, where something is being described as like something else, generally something difficult to understand in terms of something easier to understand, but not always. And this is a really interesting example of what you are looking at is the sound of hell. So the sound of hell is described as so visceral, so physical, that it's like a wind that blows down trees and scatters flocks of sheep into the text space. And it's an incredibly powerful image, but I even like this one more, which is the end of the Paolo and Francesca canto, Canto 5 in the Inferno, which again, if you know the text, you'll know it ends with Dante being so moved that he faints. And at the end he falls, and I fell, he says, like a dead body falls. And of course, what you're seeing is not Dante, but the dead body that his falling is like. So you see what's going on here. That's a weird mode of illustration. I don't think I've ever seen it anywhere else. And it really raises deep questions about, well, why would someone go through and illustrate only the similes in Dante's Divine Comedy, but also what rhetorical work is this doing? Where does it put you as a reader vis-a-vis Dante's experiences and the words on the page? So, as I said, the theory is that this is, in fact, God, what's their name? I'll think of it in a minute. The Sangallo family, illustrating through several generations their copy of the Commedia using some form of lost design by Leonardo da Vinci. I'm not persuaded by either of those arguments as it happens, but Leonardo is obviously a key figure when thinking about word and image. I mean, Leonardo's own inventions famously combine word and image, but Leonard Barkan has recently shown that word and image were more intimately connected in Renaissance artistic practice to core than we tend to appreciate. So in Michelangelo, A Life on Paper, Barkan explains that the artist not only filled hundreds of sheets of paper with exquisite drawings, sketches, and doodles, but also on fully a third of his sheets composed his own literary words. And Barkan argues, as you can see here, that we cannot understand Michelangelo without a radical sense of the way that pictures and words entangled themselves in his creative imagination. Now, finally, to come to Erasmus, the same might be said from the other side of the word-image divide of the so-called Prince of Humanists, Desiderius Erasmus. Now, at first glance, this suggestion may strike you as absurd. As an artist, for starters, Erasmus is no Michelangelo. He's only known to have produced a handful of images, and this playful self-portrait from the Scholia on the Letters of St. Jerome may be the best of the bunch. And in fact, in a period when you have people like Alberti who can apparently do absolutely everything, it's really nice to find someone as gifted as Erasmus who really struggled to draw a straight line. Now, more seriously, Erasmus shares with many of the more ardent Protestant reformers a deep suspicion of the power of images and routinely warns his readers to resist the seductions of the eye. In his Enchiridion Militis Christiani, or Handbook of the Christian Soldier, first written in 1503 and published in revised form in 1518, Erasmus provides an extended gloss on the Augustinian distinction between inner and outer man, possessing two sets of eyes, one to perceive visible signs and another to take us toward invisible grace. So he observes that the body, being itself visible, takes pleasure in visible things, but the soul, with its heavenly origins, despises those things that are seen, for it knows that they are transitory. He went further in the subsequent section on the rules of true Christianity to say, perfect piety is the attempt to progress always from visible things to invisible. Since we are but pilgrims in the visible world, we should never make it our fixed abode. But he saves his most vehement anti-visual comments for a scathing critique of the veneration of relics that leaves little room for doubt about his preference for scriptura over pictura. If you venerate mutant dead ashes and ignore Paul's living image, still speaking and breathing as it were in his writings, is not your religion utterly absurd? You worship the bones of Paul preserved in a relic casket, but do not worship the mind of Paul hidden away in his writings? You make much of a piece of his body visible through a glass covering, and you do not marvel at the whole mind of Paul shining through his writings. You give homage to an image of Christ's countenance represented in stone or wood, or depicted in color. With how much more religious feeling should you render homage to the image of his mind, which has been reproduced in the Gospels through the artistry of the Holy Spirit? So at this point, for a lecture saying it's exploring the relationship between reading, seeing, and drawing within a key Renaissance figure, Erasmus looks like the worst possible choice. But there is, of course, more than meets the eye here, and it is sometimes difficult with Erasmus and his fellow humanists to disentangle belief and rhetoric. After all, as Erwin Panofsky objected in his classic article on Erasmus and the visual arts, Erasmus was by no means an iconoclast. Panofsky cites as evidence a typically balanced passage from the Modus Orandi of 1525. Not all images are to be banished from the churches, but the people have to be taught in what way to use them. There are images which provoke us to lasciviousness rather than piety, yet even these we tolerate because we see more harm in eliminating in tolendo than in tolerating, in tolerando. And in his De Amabili Ecclesiae Concordia, Erasmus acknowledges that idolatry, that is the cult of images, is a horrible crime, but immediately goes on to remind his readers that since the arts of sculpture and painting were once counted among the liberal arts, this silent poetry can at times have a stronger effect on human emotions than a man, even an eloquent one, could ever achieve by words. Now, the first part of that passage places Erasmus firmly within reformist discourse on images, but the rest of the passage betrays his deep grounding in classical aesthetic theory, invoking Horace's doctrine of ut pictura poesis, as in painting, so in poetry. And as his fellow humanists would have spotted, he's here quoting the pro-painting half of Plutarch's early formulation of what would much later come to be called the sister arts. Painting is silent poetry, poetry a speaking picture. And if art, even in these religious writings, peeks through as a surprisingly common subject for Erasmus, Erasmus himself stands out as a surprisingly common subject for artists, generating enough images in different media to fill a massive catalog published in 2008 called Images of Erasmus. This famous drawing by Hans Holbein the Younger captures the ghostly gaze and disembodied hand of the great Dutch humanist and serves as a study for the much more famous painting of Erasmus in his study, one of two portraits of the bookish Erasmus that he painted in 1523. Now, within a couple of years, Holbein had produced yet another iconic image of his friend and patron, placing him within the kind of architectural frame he had been designing for the title pages of Erasmus's books, and Dürer would add his own engraving of a scholar all but surrounded by the tools of his trade. And with the Greek motto in particular, the Latin says that it's a true effigy of the image of Erasmus of Rotterdam, but the Greek motto in the middle implies that the truer portrait is to be found in his words rather than in the image of his body. A few years earlier, a third major artist, Quentin Massys, took Erasmus as the subject for one of the period's finest portrait medals. And Brian Cummings has suggested in his Margaret Mann Phillips lecture at the RSA a few years back that Erasmus was one of the few authors in the period, and quite possibly the first in the new culture of print, who was instantly recognizable via their visual image. And that certainly came through. If anyone saw the Dürer show at the National Gallery, for me, it was almost a show on Erasmus and St. Jerome as much as on Dürer. And this came through extremely powerfully. We're thus confronted with a tension, if not an outright paradox, at the heart of Erasmus's relationship with the image. The author who warned readers time and again not to make the visible world our fixed abode clearly felt equally at home in the scholar's study and the artist's studio. And the more he was represented by images, the more he urged us to turn back to his writings, where we would find, as with Paul and Christ, the so-called truer portrait. As Lisa Jardine shows in the very opening chapter of Erasmus, Man of Letters, called A Better Portrait of Erasmus Will His Writings Show, the translation of this Greek motto, also found on the back of the medal here, the great scholar's successful campaign of self-fashioning was perfectly poised between the visual and the verbal. So as the iconoclastic project picks up steam around Erasmus, he himself becomes more open to the power of images. And this power for him is by no means new in the 1510s, even the late 1510s. The relationship between text and images had in fact occupied him as a rhetorical and pedagogical project long before it became a religious problem. So when, late in his life, he compiles a list of his writings for a complete edition of his works, he assigns to the first volume a set of titles that concern what he calls the institution of letters or literature, the most influential of which are his massive handbook on the so-called copious style, or De Copia, and his little treatise on the methods of study, De Ratione Studii, both written in the 1490s and circulated in an astonishing number of copies and editions during his lifetime. And when we turn back to these texts, we quickly discover the extent to which images were already playing a crucial role in the humanist pedagogical program as he received and reshaped it. In his work on the instruction of young pupils, Erasmus acknowledged that children learn their stories and fables with greater enthusiasm and remember them more easily if the contents are displayed before their eyes by means of skillful illustration, and if every story is presented through pictures. He was following the general lead here of Alberti's crucial concept for more mature readers and writers of historia, that is both history and story, in which narrative was at its most effective when it will capture the eye of whatever learned or unlearned person is looking at it and will move his soul. Now, such strategies had their roots in the ancient Greek idea of enargia, usually translated into Latin as evidentia and into English as vividness. Erasmus himself provides the period's best definition from one of the most famous passages in his most famous book, De Copia. And you see here, we employ enargia whenever, for the sake of amplifying or decorating our passage or giving pleasure to our readers, instead of setting out the subject in bare simplicity, we fill in the colors and set it up like a picture to look at, so that we seem to have painted the scene rather than described it, and the reader seems to have seen rather than read. We can take an action which is either in process or completed, and instead of presenting it in bare and insubstantial outline, bring it before the eyes with all the colors filled in, so that our hearer or reader is carried away and seems to be in the audience at a theater. Now, in the De Copia, Erasmus praises Homer above all as the source of portable comparisons that have the power to transport the reader in this way. And he, of course, spends much of his time combing ancient texts for metaphors and similes, publishing them in the ready-made source book he calls parabolae or paravoli. But it's clear that he also wishes young students to develop these skills and sources for themselves and construct their own storehouse from their own sources for their own needs. In an oft-quoted passage from the De Ratione Studii, or on the method of study, Erasmus prescribes an active mode of reading with pen in hand to pick out important words and passages with special marks. And here he suggests that in the construction of a storehouse or thesaurus of useful material, the memory is aided by both places, topoi, and the images or imagenes that represent them. And he suggests that things which it is necessary but difficult to remember might be hung up on the walls of a room where they are generally conspicuous, or inscribed at the beginning and end of your books, or engraved on rings or drinking cups, or painted on doors and walls, or even in the glass of a window, so that what may aid learning is constantly before the eye. Now, in England, these ideas would find their most influential formulation in Sir Thomas Elyot's book named The Governor of 1531, a widely read textbook on the education of young noblemen. And for Eliot, finally, we find what is in my project, The Smoking Gun, a program for training readers in which drawing becomes an integral part of the education. Now, in his chapter on portraiture, which is actually portraying representation of any kind, he begins with the commonplace that words come across more clearly when they are accompanied by pictures. And he says here, when he happeneth to read or hear any fable or history, forthwith he apprehendeth it more desirously, and retaineth it better than any other, that lacketh the said seat, the visual seat, by reason that he hath found matter apt to his fantasy. And Remember Aristotle's phantasmata. Fantasy is the crucial the crucial part of the brain. But he goes on to recommend that as the young student learns to read, he should also be taught to draw so that he can enter these memorable images for himself, and that he is perfectly instructed in portraiture and happeneth to read any noble or excellent history whereby his courage is inflamed to the imitation of virtue, he forthwith taketh his pen or pencil, and with a grave and substantial study, gathering to him all the parts of the imagination, endeavoreth himself to express lively and, as I might say, actually, in portraiture, not only the fact or affair, but also the sundry affections of every personage in the history. Now, to get a sense of what that looks like in practice, we could do worse than open the covers of this hefty volume, now at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. It's a 1549 Latin edition of Livy's Great History of Rome, central text in Renaissance humanism's curriculum for the reading of history, and of course the one that, thanks to Jardine and Grafton, has a special place in the history of reading. A catalog from Maggs Brothers, where this book was sold, described the figures in the margins, and I'll stop at that one, as having the air of being characters in a play, which makes sense when we consider, and there's Lucrece, there's someone with his head cut off, and there is Coriolanus, which makes sense when we consider that annotations and illustrations in this book have been attributed to none other than Nicholas Udall, one of England's most influential Erasmian schoolmasters, and one of the most successful playwrights in the generation before Shakespeare. Sadly, there is no comparative or comparable evidence that Erasmus himself practiced what he preached in this way, but he did have a hand in orchestrating what may be the single most famous example of a reader-illustrated book in the entire early modern period. And that book brings together one of his most familiar texts, known in English as In Praise of Folly, or Moriae Encomium in Greek, with the artist to whom he was closest, Hans Holbein the Younger. The text is written in 1509 during his journey from Italy to England. Riding through the Alps, he conceives the notion of writing a mock encomium or speech in praise of something, in this case, in praise of folly, partly as a humanist exercise in praising the unpraisable, but also as a sort of in-joke for the circle, the very close circle around his friend Thomas More, whose surname in Greek resembles the word for folly. So encomium, Moriae encomium is in praise of More and in praise of folly at the same time. The text is printed in 1511 and then reprinted in 1515 by Froben and Basel. Now that edition, 1515, was expanded and surrounded by learned marginal notes from the hand of a doctor and Greek scholar named Lystrius, using material supplied by Erasmus himself. And a very special exemplar, now at the Basel Kunstmuseum, was heavily customized by at least two men. The first was a schoolmaster named Myconius, who was responsible for most of the handwritten marginalia in brown and red ink throughout the volume. And among the notes is this particularly interesting visual scheme, echoing perhaps the shape of Froben's printer's device, delineating the chief virtues to be gathered in reading the book. It's a reading of Erasmus using Erasmus's own prescribed methods, including sententiae, metaphors, similes, and then the bottom item, images. Now, once again, these images are figurative or rhetorical, but they are also literal, since Myconius arranged for a gifted young artist, the 17-year-old Hans Holbein the Younger, to add no fewer than 80 marginal drawings to the large, ample edges of the book. Now, a note by Holbein records that the images were completed in 10 days at the end of 1515 and the beginning of 1516, so just after the book was printed. They therefore constitute his earliest surviving work, as well as the means by which he became known to both Froben and Erasmus, for whom he would go on to work extensively. Now, the work is clearly intended, at least in part, as an extension of the kind of humanist circle in-joke that you get in the text itself relating to Thomas More. There are a lot of tributes of various kinds to Erasmus himself. And here you see Holbein's image of Erasmus writing a book that's already printed as Adagia Erasme, I think, on the side. So it's his adages there. This flattering portrait leads to an affectionate rebuke by Erasmus himself, to the effect that if he really looked this good, he would find a wife at once, he says. And that seems to have led to another portrait in a different ink, also by Holbein, at the base of a much earlier page, in which an older and more foolish Erasmus is shown walking through the market and being so distracted by the sight of a pretty woman that he steps into the basket of eggs being sold at his feet. But Erasmus is not the only target of Holbein's satirical hand. There's the cruel schoolmaster, the unworldly mathematician, the hunched poet, the bookish philosopher. And of course, the starring role throughout the book in this cast of characters is the motley fool himself. Now, in a perceptive early article on this volume, the Warburg Institute's first director, Fritz Axel, argued that Holbein's drawings are poised between medieval and Renaissance modes of representation. And in fact, the same is especially clear of the whole multi-layered mise-en-page, which is astonishingly complex and temporally odd, and nowhere more so than in the opening page of the text proper, which plays with a number of textual, spatial, and rhetorical protocols. But the complexity cuts even deeper than that, and I don't have time to go into it too much now. We can come back to it in the Q&A in a few minutes if you like. But by the end of the text, it actually isn't very clear what the message is and who or what is being satirized. So by the end of the text, when Folly finally steps down from the podium, the relationship between word and image has been rendered so sophisticated, so unstable, that it's no longer clear what is being satirized and what is being venerated, what looks backward and what looks forward, whether word and image are working in tandem, in parallel, or in outright opposition. So to finish this discussion of the project, in my earlier work on marginalia, I found that these types of evidence, these notes, are almost always less useful for the answers that they provide than for the questions they raise. In the case of Erasmus, as we've been looking at here, add some new ones to our ever-growing agenda in this field. Are people who scribble in books aberrant or exemplary? Are drawings in the margins the product of attention or inattention? Are they sites of meditation or are they signs of sacrilege? What can marginal images teach us about the movements of the eye, of the mind, and of the memory across the early modern page? What's the best way to describe the tools and products of the reader's eye? Annotation, illustration, doodle, sketch, prosthesis, icon, mnemonic aid, something else? In what ways did Renaissance readers see reading as an embodied act, and specifically, moving from my earlier work on the manicule to this work, how did the eye, rather than the hand, serve as the instrument of apprehension? And are the eyes, finally, of Renaissance readers different from those of medieval, or for that matter, modern readers, and if so, in which ways? What might visual marginalia ultimately have to teach us about what another Warburg scholar, Michael Baxendall, famously called the period eye? Now, these are all questions that I wouldn't have known how to ask without Lisa Jardine, and in fact still find it hard to answer without being able to discuss them with her. She continues to guide me. She's one of those people whose voice you continue to hear. I'm sure I'm not the only one who continues to hear Lisa's voice. She continues to guide me as I make my way through the margins in search of marks that I don't yet understand. Not a day goes by when I don't miss her presence alongside me on the proverbial book wheel. But her words, written, spoken, and remembered, still lead me as I try to look through the eyes of Renaissance readers to whom we both devoted our scholarly lives. Which takes me back by way of conclusion to Erasmus, Man of Letters. The book was finally published in paperback by Princeton in 2015, more than 2 decades after its initial publication, and alas, the year Lisa would finally lose her long battle with cancer. A new preface allowed her to look back at the initial reception of the book, which she was pleased to say had been far more positive than she expected, and to pay fresh tribute to the achievements of Erasmus, for whom her admiration had clearly grown in the intervening years. In a sense, she herself had by then successfully, if mostly tacitly, followed in Erasmus's footsteps. She had founded a Center for Editing Lives and Letters, whose pedagogical and public programs were modeled in many ways on the example of Erasmus, and where many of Erasmus's great textual projects would have been right at home. She had become a celebrity author in her own right and had largely moved from traditional scholarly monographs to popular biographies of famous figures in the arts and sciences. She had also, like a modern-day civic humanist, applied her learning to public service as a broadcaster and as a judge of book prizes, but also, and much more unusually, as the chair of the government's Human Embryology and Fertility Commission. But her most Erasmian achievement of all, at least in retrospect, was the gradual cultivation of an extended familia, which spread from Cambridge to London, from Princeton to the Low Countries, and in which I had the great good service, alongside some of you, to serve my academic apprenticeship. So here's how she put it in the preface, in a passage written about Erasmus, but with at least one eye, I think, on her own career. Erasmus had his familia, and I have mine. I had written in my original acknowledgements. At that time, I was referring to my circle of students, colleagues, and friends who have always supported me in my intellectual pursuits. The appearance of Erasmus, Man of Letters, enlarged that familia and deepened my sense of awe at Erasmus's enduring ability to humanize a circle. The ripples of his influence on humane learning and conduct continue to spread like those on the limpid surface of a large pond. And I can think of no better way to describe Lisa's own rare gift for galvanizing a group in the classroom, in the boardroom, on the airwaves, all in the service of humane learning and conduct. May the ripples of her influence continue to spread. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bill, for that absolutely brilliant lecture and for ending with the familia, which is
started
exactly, yeah. What an explosion though of words and images, and a very complicated relationship between the two. I know that there will be questions from the audience here. I suspect that there may also be questions online, which Julian will help us to garner and harvest. But shall we begin by saying if there are any questions in the room? James. Oh yes, of course, we need the microphone. Let's not forget that, yeah.
Thank you. Fascinating, illuminating in many ways. Funnily enough, I kept thinking of the film Seven before you started, and so when you went into the Divine Comedy, I thought it was a bit spooky. But my question is part of the solution to perhaps understanding what some of these images are, is by comparing what the artists were able to do away. So in other words, was there enough other material for them to sketch or doodle away from these books, or was the only opportunity they had within the books? And do we know if any of the artists, for example, the early Holbein that you showed there, do we know what he was doing away from the books
Sure.
as studies? So therefore, is there some sense of when he approached the books, he was doing something in the books, or was he just a continuation of what he was doing elsewhere? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. First of all, I should say that I'm not treating most of the images as the work of artists, because in most cases it isn't that clear that it is a professional artist. And even in the cases of Leonardo or Michelangelo, they are certainly great artists, but that's not all they are. So it isn't necessarily the most productive frame, and it often leads you to fall into this trap again of separating visual arts and textual culture and textual learning, which I'm precisely trying to overcome. Having said that, I mean, you could almost turn it on its head and say, you know, what were artists reading when they were starting to work? Where does invention come from? You know, is the sketchbook a sign of textual influence as much as visual observation? And again, with someone like Leonardo, there's ample evidence that that's the case. So I think again, I'm sure in some cases you can certainly track the visual sources of the visual images, but I'm more interested in an approach that sees the reading and the drawing as fundamentally interconnected. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have a question first from John Powell, and then we'll go to you two, okay?
First of all, so many thanks for this fantastic talk.
Thank you, John.
You have spoken about marginalia, images as marginalia mainly, but not about engravings, which are obviously central to 16th century book culture. So
Yes.
I was wondering whether that changes your argument. And especially this kind of idea that something is happening that's hostile to images in this period, which I don't see happening at all when I looked at my books.
No.
I mean, and especially in travel writing, which is what I've worked on. I mean, you have deep discussions about how you need the image
Exactly.
in order to explain things you cannot explain just by words. In Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, you have people like Jean Delery describing what he's going to draw and how he has not been able to have as many engravings as he wanted, but nonetheless, he's put as much information as he could in the few images he could pay for.
Yeah.
So well, that's my question, really.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. First of all, I agree that for the most part, when you look at textual culture, it doesn't really bear out that there's this. I'm certainly in the narrow world of iconoclasm and Protestant debate over images. There's plenty of evidence for a fraught relationship and for the removal of certain things, maybe more from the architectural or built landscape than from the textual landscape. But you know, the other point that you make is a very good one, and it's interesting. How does this evolve from a point where there's very little engraved or associated imagery into one where the books tend to come with pictures in them to some extent. And again, I think one of the most interesting things that I would pick up on in this case is how often those images are not the right images or enough image, and that the reader or collector, in some cases the printer, in some cases the subsequent edition, does something different or customizes or modifies. It's also very interesting to see, I mean, the birth. I was talking to some students earlier about the fact that we assume, and you can see it in Michael Camille's, it's really just an assumption that after the Reformation, this stuff all goes away. You can see why he had that feeling. But you can also assume that marginalia goes away and that drawing in books goes away. And none of those things turns out to be the case when you keep looking, but they change and different things come in. And one of the things that you can genuinely trace is the arrival and departure of different modes. And the one that came to mind earlier was the kind of craze for so-called extra illustrated books. So the way in which a printed book, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, becomes the anchor for a kind of custom anthology or portfolio of visual material that an individual chooses to gather together, sometimes in extraordinary lengths. I mean, the so-called Kitto Bible at the Huntington is maybe the most lavish example, which takes a one-volume Bible and makes it 30 volumes with, I think it's 20 or 30,000 images, all taken from other places and put in. I mean, is that marginalia? Is that, what is it? At a certain point, again, I think you move beyond these comfortable categories. But yeah, I think you're making me think again about the role of engraving in this, and actually the Botticelli and the Dante is an interesting example. The Holbein drawings, I don't know if you know, become actual engravings in future editions. So some of them, not all of those images, end up appearing in print in future editions. It's a very complicated process that I've kind of only started to think about. Yeah, thanks, Jean-Paul.
It's like Isabel next, I think, or...
Great, thank you very much. That was a really thought-provoking lecture. I wondered, with the Holbein drawings, some of the images are picked out in red.
Yeah.
And is that the hand of the author who is writing those annotations in red? And what does that tell us, or how do you think that can allow us to think about ways in which both before and after the images were added to that volume, that's being thought about? So I wondered if that's kind of coming into your discussion.
Not yet. That's the short answer. Yeah. I usually have really long answers. I must be tired. Not yet. I need to think about that one. And in fact, I need to see the volume. I have not yet been able, this is one where there's a facsimile that I've been able to use, but I don't trust the facsimile in this case. You really need the materiality of the incision of the pen on the paper. And in this case, I can't pick out layers. The photographic reproduction flattens what are often very clear layers in a physical book. So I can't really answer it yet, but it's a really interesting question. Because again, I mean, back to Lisa and the Familia, these books, I guess, are also, and this was already true of my earlier work on textual marginalia and the very beginning with Grafton and Jardine on Harvey's Livy. These are not isolated readers reading an isolated book for themselves. These are collective group social activities for socio-professional purposes. And I think you can really start to see that in the Holbein with Myconius, with Lystrius, with Erasmus, et cetera, with Moore, with Peter Gillies. It goes on and on, that circles within circles. So, yeah. But thank you.
And you also had a question. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
This was a fascinating
lecture.
I have two questions intertwined.
Okay.
And these sort of practices to me seem to gesture clearly towards mnemonic practices,
Yes.
such as the sorts that Lina Bolzoni has described in detail. And the first one is regarding the drawings of the Commedia that you have shown, that you have underscored how it's the similes that are described. I was wondering if you perhaps have considered whether this has to do with the mnemonic notion of similitudo that appears so often in early modern mnemonic treatises, where these would be some sort of imago agens or active images therefore synthesizing with the tools of energeia or evidentia, the description that we are looking here. And this leads me to the second question / commentary that I want to make.
That's also an easy one. That's yes, okay. Is the answer to that one. Thank you very much. That's an excellent invocation of the mnemotechnic world of Bolzoni, and indeed my own Francis Yates from the Warburg. So yes.
What surprises me is if this is indeed a mnemonic practice of sorts.
Yeah.
It's all the more surprising to find it in Erasmus, and you have put it the section where he mentions the system of places and images, the art of memory indeed, when Erasmus was known to be very vocal against the art of memory, as Ramus or Juan Luis Vives was as well. So how is this kind of practice of marginalia, how can this be reconciled with this distaste for the art of memory of someone like Erasmus?
Yeah, that's really interesting. With the use of places in this case, which is of course the English translation, it's probably topicide, I'm assuming. It probably isn't so much invoking the mnemonic tradition of placing something in a physical space, let's say an architectural space, in order to remember an oration. It's probably the more Aristotelian approach with topics as established kind of given subjects under which you gather. Otherwise, you'd have a heap of things that you couldn't find your way back to. So it is still about memory, but it's very much about textual organization according to places in that sense, loci communes, rather than the places of memory. But that's not to say that he isn't capable, as I've shown, of an inconsistent position. So he works for a very long time, and he also, I think, is capable of accommodating incompatible positions more than most people. So you may be onto something, but I need to look a lot more at the memory treatises and the way he's probably disingenuously dismissive. Yeah. Looks like you have something online.
Exactly. So,
amazing. What technology.
There are a few questions. Unfortunately, I brought...
Let's be fast, because I'm sure people want to drink, and I want to drink, but we'll do a couple of fast ones.
I just want to apologize for the fact that I brought neither a device of any kind, nor my glasses.
Oh, do you want mine?
I think we're going to be okay. I'll just
hold it really far away. I can read it.
But I think we have to have the question from Marie Rubin.
Hi, Mary.
A beautiful lecture, Bill. This is a project on Erasmus, but do you have any sense of how wide was this practice, whereby readers engage with text in this manner, imaging them, say by intellectual discipline, or by region, or by religion, gender, status? Lisa would have loved this lecture.
Thanks, Mary. It actually is just the small section on Erasmus. There's as with used books, I have found that I have to do this by case study. There's really no other way to tease out the complexity or richness of the questions raised by the evidence. I have found that I cannot do justice to it. I've tried in a more general overview. And because of that, it leaves me, as with other work on marginalia, maybe vulnerable to not being able to answer that question, because the big picture is really elusive. In this case, I mean, I've been working on this now since Used Books, which I'm embarrassed to realize was published in 2008. So it's not exactly a recent book. I have been looking at this for a while now and continually shocked by what I hadn't seen before. And I think because of that, it's too early to say yet how much of this is out there, how widespread it is, in what ways. And I think the examples really do cut across religious divides, certainly national divides, socio-professional divides, and I think possibly gender divides. I mean, it depends on whether you take some of the really interesting, active, and interventionist reading practices of like the Little Gidding community into purview for a project like this, which I think you could. I think female religious communities are very involved in the interface of word and image in a very proactive way. And I think that, of course, is familiar again from medieval monastic culture and medieval religious culture. But I think I'm finding it in more places. And again, I just think part of the purpose of the project is simply to hopefully allow other people to not see. And that's really what it is, because it's amazing what you can miss, what the eye, I mean, we all know that from modern studies of these videos where a gorilla goes across the screen during a dance and you never notice it. But the ability to overlook the unfamiliar or the thing that doesn't make sense according to your questions or your training is pretty profound. And so in this case, kind of, I think it's still early days, but Miri, keep your eyes open and tell me what you find, and let's get together and talk about it.
So I think we have just one final question from the Zoom audience. It's a rather personal question from Susanna. What do you doodle in your margins?
Oh, well, fortunately, I'm a really bad artist. And I think in this case, it probably is convenient, but I don't doodle, but I have always, since first studying marginalia, tried to emulate the practices. It's a bit like here in Cambridge when I was in the MPhil year, I think it was, rather than the PhD, we did the training in the UL on a facsimile, hand press, printing press, to learn really what's involved in making a book and how badly wrong it can go. And I think that was a huge eye-opening experience. And similarly, I think sometimes you really do have to learn by doing. So I tend to copy early Renaissance examples. So I've been desperately trying to develop my own pointing hand because it is incredibly useful. I also there are two other favorite visual devices in the margins of early books: the flower, the trefoil, or the flower with a kind of curly stem. That one I do a lot. And then the face in profile, which grows out of brackets on the side of a text. So not very exciting, I'm afraid. I'm sure there's more embarrassing stuff, but I'm not going to reveal it now. Only at the bar. So sorry, you're out of luck. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Bill, again, for a brilliant lecture. I think you've demonstrated once and for all that the optical nerve was not cut.
Not lost. Exactly.
And you've also really evoked Lisa Jardine
that was
tonight,
the purpose.
which is also absolutely lovely. So
thank you, Mary.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.